In the previous video, we built the timber walls, sheathed them, and wrapped them in a breather membrane. We then looked at the different roofing options for a garden room. This week, we're going to be building the roof and then adding fascias and an EPDM covering. As a quick reminder, we're going to be building a warm roof. From a construction perspective, this is basically a cold roof with a few extra layers on top. A warm roof will add to the overall height of the building, but it should still be well within the permitted development height limit we have here in Scotland. It also means the roof can have more insulation and the insulation will be easier to install. If your building is limited to 2.5 meters, then don't worry, we'll explain how to build a cold roof later in the video. And if you're wondering what I'm talking about with permitted development and warm roofs versus cold roofs, then I suggest you look at parts 1 and 5 in this series. I started building the roof by selecting the 3 best joists and then locating them as accurately as possible in the center and 2 edges of the roof. I had to get a little bit creative here because I was on my own and it was a little bit tricky, but yeah, I just about make it. To lock the joists in place, I use these roofing tie truss clips. It's important to mechanically fix your joists down because in high winds, there'll be a low pressure that builds above the roof, a positive pressure beneath the roof, and despite the weight of everything involved, it can just lift your roof off. So it's important to secure the roof down with some means. I use these brackets because they're cheap and easy to install, and I felt that they would do the job very well. An alternative and the most common approach to securing the joist is to toenail fixings in like this. I'm sure this works just fine, but to me it just didn't feel accurate or secure enough. Through the project I put some of the clips on the outside wall and some of the clips on the inside wall. For some reason it felt like doing them on the inside wall was easier, but honestly whatever works for you. With those 3 joists put in place as accurately as possible, I then put on the front and rear timbers. Because again I was working on my own at this point, I created this little jig so that it would support the timber as I worked. Although I took the time to select one of the better bits of timber, I found that it was still bowed slightly and it needed a few clamps in the centre to pull it down and keep everything flush and straight before I could sink the fixings in. And then I was given some help to lift the remaining joists into position. I had previously organised the joists into an order so that I would get the flattest, straightest, best roof. And once again I secured each joist down with a clip, and at the ends I screwed it in with 2 125mm fixings through the outside timber and into the ends of the joists. And then off camera I added these noggins. They aren't strictly necessary on a span as small as this, but it does help to pull all the timbers square and just into the right position. The next job on the agenda was to add an OSB top deck. I added these timber upstands so that I could slide the sheets up to them and give me a reference to work from. Leading up to this, we were worried that getting the sheets onto the roof was going to be really difficult, as 18mm OSB is heavy. But by propping it onto a stool and then tilting it over the edge, it really wasn't too bad. And regardless of what anybody else says, this does need to be an 18mm sheet. This layer is taking the majority of the forces on the roof. It's resisting any twist and warp that might be happening. It's a structural layer that needs to be strong. It's also a fixing point that we'll be using later on in the build. And as with any OSB, you want to leave a 3mm expansion gap between the sheets. And you're going to want to secure the sheets down with screws rather than nails because nails will work loose over time due to the forces involved. Up until this point, a warm roof and a cold roof are both built exactly the same way, but from here on out the 2 options diverge. If we wanted a cold roof, we would need to reduce the height of the noggins to maintain a 50mm air gap below the top deck, We then put as much insulation as we could manage between the joists while maintaining the air gap and have a vapor control layer beneath the joists. Since we're allowed to build a taller structure under the permitted development regulations in our area, we're going to go for a warm roof, which means we're done on the underside of the structure. Our next job is to add a vapor control layer to the top of the top deck, and we're going to be using this black polythene as our vapor control layer. Although I'm not sure why we did this, because the breather membrane we use for the walls is also rated for roof usage, and it is a higher quality membrane. I think that's just a mistake that we made down the road. And then with the vapor control layer in place, we add a timber upstand around 3 edges of the roof. We left it off the lower edge of the roof because we were going to leave this for a little while and we wanted rainwater to be able to flow off. We secured the upstand down with pocket hole screws, and the purpose of the upstand is to encapsulate the insulation, protecting it, as well as providing a layer for the fascia material to secure onto. You might also notice that we run our vapor control layer under the upstand rather than up the insides. We explain why we do this in the previous video, but the long and short of it is this seems to be more appropriate for a garden room build with a roof type like this, and it has a lot of advantages and it prevents a lot of potential problems. After a few rainy days had passed, we put in the final upstand and we were ready for the insulation. We used 100mm PIR insulation on top of the roof, which we're confident will provide plenty of thermal insulation. We will also run rock wool between the rafters, although this is primarily for acoustic insulation. There were a few jobs on this project which proved to be really satisfying, and this was one of them. We managed to get near perfect fit between all of the sheets, which meant we had to use hardly any expanding foam to fill up any voids. Dora then went around and taped up all of the seams. This is an important job because it not only prevents thermal losses, it also prevents vapor moving through the building, and whatever we can do to prevent vapor moving will increase the life and health of the building. The next layer of the roof is an 11mm OSB top deck. Dora laid these sheets on the ground in the pattern that the roof will be, drew out a grid and started drilling holes for the thermally isolated fixings that we'll be using. We then brought the OSB sheets onto the roof and secured them around the perimeter with external screws into the upstand. 11mm OSB is fine for this job because it's not structural, it's only there for something for the roofing membrane to secure to. I thoroughly recommend these fixings. They're thermally isolated, which means you haven't got a heatsink effectively radiating heat from your warm side to your cold side, but also they're slightly telescopic, which means as your roof expands and contracts through the seasons, it's not going to have a screw poking up through your membrane, potentially damaging it. We followed the manufacturer's guidance for the number of fixings per sheet. One of the nice things about this system is you don't need to screw into a joist, just the 18mm OSB below. That makes life an awful lot easier. We laid all the fixings out in this grid pattern because not only is it distributing the load better, but it also appeases our OCD when we will look down on the roof from our house later on. When we completed it, we did feel that some of the seams had a little bit too much movement, so added additional fixings at those edges. Next, we'll be adding fascias to the outside of the building. This is much easier to do now rather than when we've got roof membrane in place. So we add fascia around the perimeter, leaving a 20mm gap for the timber cladding that we'll be using below. Now, it's unlikely that we'll be able to source fascias at the perfect height, so we had to fill in this gap above with a piece of scrap timber. We could then lay the roofing membrane over the top and add the roof trim. We started out by cutting our fascias to length. This is easily done at a miter saw, which gives you a really nice finish if you take it nice and slow. If you don't have a miter saw, you can do it with a hand saw, but you're not going to get as nice a finish. We then mark the center point of our fascia and the location for all our fixings. It's important that your fixture pattern is quite consistent, as it's going to affect the overall look of the building when you're finished. We then partially nailed in all of the nails, as it's much easier to do now rather than it's flopping around on the roof, and remove the protective layer. If you don't remove the layer now, they can get trapped under the nail heads and it can be very difficult to remove. We want to use timber soffits that are 20mm thick. That means we need to offset the fascias by 20mm. To do that, I made this simple jig which will hold the fascias in the correct position while I secure them. The fascias can be quite floppy, which makes them difficult to work with. I lined up the center line of the building with the center line of the fascias and got to nailing. I was sure to keep each board 5 or 10mm short of the roof to allow for expansion. To treat the corners, I have this corner trim which I simply super glue in place. I then cut a piece of 11mm OSB to fill up the gap above the fascia on the front and side edges. On the rear, where we'll eventually locate a gutter, I need to extend that piece of wood by an additional 25mm so that water can run off the roof and into the gutter. And then onto that timber batten, I secure the first part of the gutter drip trim. We then lifted the roofing membrane onto the roof. Some of the observant amongst you might have noticed we're mixing up our timelines a little bit here. That's because it's a good idea to leave your membrane out to relax a little bit in the sun before you install it. This is an EPDM roofing membrane. It's a really robust roofing material that should last for about 50 years. We purchased ours from Rubber for Roofs, and they have a really good roofing kit calculator where you just enter all your details and it builds the kit for you, and you can even add in extras like rollers and so forth to make your life really easy. We also went for the premium 1.5mm membrane, and we have also managed to negotiate a 5% discount using the code Maker's Manual. So if you're interested in a roof membrane, do put in that discount. We get a small commission and you get a 5% discount. With the membrane laid out and left to rest for a few hours, we folded up the edges and marked in 150mm from the edges. This is because we use a different kind of adhesive for those edges. This is a job that's definitely much easier with 2 people, especially on a roasting hot day like this was, where the adhesive dries very quickly. We started out by rolling up the membrane onto one half of the roof very neatly. We could then apply the adhesive, staying within that 150mm border, and then unroll it as we worked. And it does make a brilliant noise as the roller moves over those telescopic fixings. I must admit, this is one of those jobs that I can get very stressed at. When you've got adhesive that's drying rapidly and you've got to achieve everything on a certain timeline, it can get stressful. But me and Dora had a good plan, and soon we found we fell into a rhythm, and it actually became enjoyable, dare I say. One of us would apply the adhesive, the other would unroll the mat and then sweep it in to remove any air bubbles and to create a good solid bond between the 2 surfaces. Although applying this membrane might seem daunting, I would recommend it as a DIY project. With the decking adhesive drying in the center of the roof, I applied the much stronger contact adhesive around the perimeters. I apply a thin layer to both the EPDM membrane and the OSB and wait for it to become touch dry before I let them touch. Once they do touch, it's going to be a permanent bond, so I have to work very carefully here. Also, because it's such a hot day, the adhesive was going off very quickly, so I had to work quickly. With the adhesive touch dry, I could then fold back the membrane and use a roller to ensure there was good contact between the layers. I could then install the second part of the gutter drip trim. The two halves do nest into each other nicely, so it's clear where you should fix them. And with the gutter trim in place, I can then use it as a ruler to cut away the excess membrane with a nice sharp knife. I then went round the other three edges, cutting away freehand, aiming for a 50mm overhang. I got away with it just fine, but I probably should have measured it out properly and cut with scissors. So maybe a case of do as I say, not as I do. I then neatly folded up the corners into these pig ears and held it in place with a staple gun with stainless steel staples. It's important to do this as neatly as possible because it will affect how the trim will sit on top of it. This is the edge trim which you'll want to use on the sides and front of the building. It has this memory foam section which you'll want to compress between 30 and 50% to get a good watertight seal. It also has pre-drilled holes which makes fixing it very easy. For the front elevation we needed to use two lengths of trim, so we made sure we had a good expansion gap between the two and then put in this joining clip to neaten it up. We also had corner trim to neaten up the corners, all secured with super glue. And that is the roof and fascias complete, and it feels so good to have a watertight structure. In the next video, we're going to be fitting the UPVC windows and doors. So until then, cheerio!